Hello, I'm Paul Behrman, and this is Talking About The Who, a new podcast dedicated to that nice rock and roll band from Shepherd's Bush, London. Sandringham, August 2023. That was the last time I saw The Who live. And I found myself wondering soon afterwards if that was maybe their last ever gig. Now, I wasn't overly surprised when they were back on stage 7 months later for 2 Teenage Cancer Trust gigs at the Royal Albert Hall, playing with the orchestra as they had done at Sandringham. From what I heard, the first night in particular was quite rough and ready, with things going wrong throughout, and Roger and Pete providing some entertaining banter as a result. The kind of Who show that I suspect most of us want to see whenever we do venture out to see them do their thing live. It's good to know that even now, you never quite know what's going to happen on stage at a Who gig, and maybe pondering the end of the band as a live force is slightly premature. Since those Albert Hall gigs, there's been no Who activity, with Roger even saying early this year that he might finally be done with that part of his life. But in recent weeks, Pete did an interview with The Standard, confirming that he had recently met with Roger for lunch, and that they would definitely be doing something Who related in 2025. To quote Pete from the interview, "The last big tours that we've done have been with a full orchestra, which was glorious, but we're now eager to make a noise, and make a mess, and make mistakes." He also stated that Roger isn't as keen as he is to make another Who album. So it seems likely that the Who-related activity next year Pete talks about will be live shows. And if this is the case, what kind of Who show do we want to see in 2025? From what Pete says, they're done with the orchestra. As much as I personally enjoyed that particular venture, I think it's probably right to now knock it on the head. During those shows, the orchestra would leave the stage for a few songs in the middle of the set, and we'd be left momentarily with a 7-man Who lineup playing some of the classics. Is this what the new shows will look like? Personally, I'm not sure I'm keen on this idea. I think they need to do something different, something that suits where Roger and Pete currently are in life. Could this be something similar to what Roger was doing with his solo band on his recent summer tour of America? Not necessarily full-on acoustic, but a more laid-back kind of sound nonetheless, with 9 or 10 other musicians on stage. From what I've seen, those shows were great, and Jodie Linscott told us in the last episode how much fun they were to play. Roger may seem to be more stilted on stage these days, but his voice is still fantastic. Speaking of full-on acoustic, I think that also could work for a live Who show in 2025. Whether it's as a 6-piece, a 7-piece, or again, 9 or 10 other musicians filling out the sound. And what sort of material should the band play next year? The typical greatest hits? Plenty of lesser-known material? A mix of the two? During his appearance on the Fisher Protocol in January, writer and photographer Matt Kent said he'd like to see The Who finally perform Lifehouse on stage, something they've never done at any point in their career, and this would therefore make the Who circle complete. But here's a thought. Regardless of whether they carry on with the orchestra or not, maybe they should consider doing some of their very early, more obscure material on stage next year. I'm thinking stuff like Bald-Headed Woman, Daddy Rolling Stone, Much Too Much, The Good's Gone, songs that, to my knowledge, they haven't played live since they were first released. Roger has talked about his vocal style on those early Who songs, and how he was 21 years old, a few years off finding his own voice for The Who, and instead mimicking the blues and soul singers who helped inspire that maximum R&B sound, and therefore sounding 3 times older than he was at the time. Well, Roger is now 80 years old, and surely those early songs would suit his voice as it is now, more so than ever before. Just imagine it, The Who playing Bald-Headed Woman in 2025. What about The Who playing Bald-Headed Woman in 2025 with the orchestra, gradually building the song to an intense crescendo? Am I the only one who'd be curious to see this? But orchestra or no orchestra, it would be glorious to hear those early B-sides and debut album tracks brought back to life on the stage in the autumn years of The Who's career. It'd be unexpected. It'd be thrilling. It'd be very Who-like, don't you think? Let's now bring it back to the here and now, as I introduce today's special guest, Chris Charlesworth. So who is Chris Charlesworth? Chris is an author who has recently released a memoir titled Just Backdated, Melody Maker, 7 Years in the 70s, which is full of great stories about not only The Who, but so many other bands and artists that Chris came into contact with while working for Melody Maker in the 70s, and I highly recommend it. He's also written books about The Who specifically, including the illustrated biography, which came out in 1982 and was given to me as one of those Christmas or birthday presents when I was a kid that I talked about in the last episode, and was likely labelled as being from Pete Townsend. Chris was responsible for the release of the 30 Years of Maximum R&B box set in 1994, which then led to the re-release of The Who's entire back catalogue on CD, remixed and remastered, and featuring previously unreleased bonus tracks. Chris was managing editor at publisher Omnibus Press from 1983 to 2016, and had a hand in the release of Tony Fletcher's Keith Moon biography, Dear Boy, in 1998. He also writes a blog, also called Just Backdated, which is well worth checking out. I spoke to Chris remotely in October this year, and was lucky enough to receive an advance copy of his new memoir shortly beforehand. As well as talking about The Who, we also covered his time at Melody Maker, and some of those other bands and artists he writes about in the memoir. And so, without any further ado, here's my conversation with Chris Charlesworth. But yeah, I have read the book, read the whole thing. I really enjoyed it, and yeah, thanks a lot for arranging for that to be sent to me.
That's all right. I'm glad you. I enjoyed writing it. I don't know. I actually started it quite a while ago because I had an offer from another publisher, or at least another publisher approached me, and they asked me to produce some sample text. So I did 10,000 words and submitted it to them. Then they changed their mind. They said that their sales team at the sort of meeting said they didn't think they should do it because I wasn't famous enough. So that was a terrible blow to my ego. But I enjoyed doing it, so I continued doing it just for my own amusement. And I have a blog called Just Backdated, as you're probably aware. So I put some of the stuff I wrote on the blog, but not all of it. And then I got another approach from this guy Richard Houghton at Spenwood Books to do it. So I revisited it, if you like, and spent the last 3 months of last year, in January, really knocking it into shape again and adding some new material. I was very lucky. I managed to get scans of every copy of Melody Maker published during the 1970s. So it was a bit like reading my own diary, was that. Because I joined Melody Maker in June of 1970 and left in the early months of 1977. So I had all that material that I'd written with my byline on it to choose from to stick in the book. Far more. I mean, I could have written 3 times as much if I'd wanted, but I had to skim over parts of it. And I thought that the time when I was working for Melody Maker from America was actually more interesting than the UK somehow. So that's why all of also the last really almost 3/4 of the book is set in America. First of all in Los Angeles and then in New York. I thought that was more fun, actually. It was certainly more fun from my point of view, but that was better to write about somehow. Because, well, I don't know, I think readers will be more interested in what it was like being a music writer working for a British paper from New York. Was more interesting to write about because it was a unique position, if you like. It was only Melody Maker that had a British staff man based in New York, based in America, and I was the third of 3 writers to do it, but I did it for considerably longer than my 2 predecessors. I was very lucky in that respect. And I actually loved that job, and that's why I wrote about it as much as I did. And also, the thing about being Melody Maker's man in America is that I was Melody Maker's only person in America, which meant that I got to see all the big acts and do all the big tours and all that kind of thing. So that's why it figures so prominently in the book.
Yeah, I think the thing that really blew my mind from reading the book was while you were in living in America, not only did you have the rent and your gas, electricity, and utility bills paid
Oh
for
yeah,
by the publishers, but also a living allowance and your normal salary sent back to your bank account
yeah, it
in
was
England.
staggeringly good. This arrangement, if that's what you want to call it, was similar to if I'd been a reporter and the New York guy on the Times or the Telegraph or the Guardian or any of the British papers that had a full-time person in America. They more or less have to accommodate you at their expense when you're sent to work there. The, I don't think the rents in New York were any higher than the rents in London at the time. They probably are now, much higher. But they've got that. They've got to. I mean, you're stuck over there, and and they've got to find someone for where you to live. They can't put you up in a hotel full time, which they did to start with, of course. But I had to find my own place, and you have to organise your own kind of domestic life, if that's what you want to call it. It's not like just going to the office every day when you're working in London. I mean, your home is your office, so that's why they have to pay for it. I figured, um, but it was very remunerative, of course, was this because, as I say, all these expenses were paid. They gave me $150 a week living allowance, and they picked up the rent and the gas and the electricity and the phone bill, which was huge, of course. Um, and meanwhile, my salary was mounting up back home in London, and I wasn't spending it. So yeah, that was a terrific aspect of it. But that was just a perk, if you like, a bonus. The great part about it was being able to go on the road with all these rock stars and get close to them.
Yeah, I mean, and one takeaway I got from the book was that it does sound like it was the dream job, especially around that time with the bands that were going at that time, and obviously the Who, but others like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and there's so many others so many stories in the book about so many
I
different
know
artists.
that's yeah. I take your point there. The thing about it is that though it's all very well saying, "Oh, what a fabulous job," I actually did work very hard. If I think I make this point in the book that even though some people might not regard it as work to go on the road with rock bands and see them 3 or 4 times in a week, but and write about them. But it was work, and I had to churn out the copy for London week in, week out, and I try to make that point in the book as well. But it was nothing for me to do 2 or 3 interviews in one week, all of them say 2,000 words or more, a couple of show reviews, and then that New York news column that I had to write every single week as well. So every Thursday I had this big package of A4 sheets of paper that I typed everything out on, put it all together into a packet with some photographs that I'd got probably from my New York photographer guy, Bob Gruen, put the package together for a courier to take to London for Friday morning. And of course, if I missed that deadline, then I'd screwed up big time. And the boss, Ray Coleman, the editor of Melody Maker, would be on the phone screaming at me. So I had to work very hard. Also, that the weekends, it's not like you work 9 to 5. Like the 9 to 5 is completely off the table here. And so at the weekends, I mean, concerts occur on Saturdays and Sundays. And if I'm a bit behind in the riding up, then I ride up on Saturday or Sunday. So every day was like a weekday for me. But I might have a quiet Monday, let's say. I don't know. I went to so many concerts. I didn't necessarily review them all, but I would go to the concerts just to see the act, to clock what I needed to clock if I was going to interview that act. So there might be, 3 or 4 a week, every night. But it's a question of what's work and what's play. I did go to some concerts just because I wanted to, like average banter. But of course, I never had to pay for the concerts. I was given the red carpet treatment. I don't. Apart from that time when I went on tour with Bob Dylan, well, I didn't go on with Bob Dylan, but to see Bob Dylan on the Rolling Thunder Review when I had to buy tickets from a tout outside the gig. Every other time that the tickets were given to me, it doesn't matter who I went to see, whether it was Led Zeppelin. I didn't even have tickets some of the time. I just had a backstage pass to go into the theatre, wander around, sometimes from the side of the stage, especially with groups I was fairly close to, like The Who. Um, I was backstage in the dressing room with them before the show and after the show. So, um, it's, you become almost part of the scene, as it were. Because the other ones I had to pay for was when I went down to CBGB's and I went to the Club 82 to see Blondie. Those kind of places didn't recognise Melody Maker. But I didn't mind because it wasn't much to get in anyway, only a couple of dollars or something like that.
And I guess you probably were one of the first people to shine a light on some of the bands that would have played at CBGB's at that time.
I was one of the first. I'm not sure whether I was the first, but I was certainly in the first 3 or 4. I was certainly the first British writer to write about Debbie Harry, which I'm quite proud of because she was in a group called the Stilettos at the time. And it was my friend Bob Gruen, the photographer, who sort of recommended I go and see them. So I met him at this club, this 82 club, and Debbie was on stage with 2 other girls, or 3 girl singers in the Stilettos, and she looked like a dream, And after the show, I talked to her, and Bob took a picture or 2, and I wrote a little piece. I mentioned the Stilettos in a generic piece with lots of other bands like the Ramones and Talking Heads, I think, and some you'll never have heard of who were never heard of again. But I mentioned about 5 or 6 groups, and amongst them were the Stilettos. So that was the first time Debbie Harry got a mention in any British paper, music or otherwise. And we put a picture of her in, so it's the first time Debbie's picture had appeared in a British paper, music or otherwise. And when it appeared, used to send me from London like about 5 or 6 copies of the paper. They'd airmail them over to me every week. And when I got that particular edition, I rang her up. She wasn't singing full time then. She had a job in a beauty parlor, and I called up the beauty parlor where she worked, and I said, your picture's in the paper, Debbie, and she was so excited. Can you imagine that? First time ever. And so we met, and I took her out to dinner and gave her a copy of the paper. She was really chuffed to have her picture in the paper. So when you think how many millions of times Debbie Harry has had her picture in the paper since the summer of 1974 when this happened, it's extraordinary to think. But the nice thing is that she never forgot. And all through the years since, I've been to Blondie shows and I've usually been invited backstage. I'm quite friendly with the drummer, Clem, as well. And I see her backstage, and she says, "Oh, Chris," and she says, "Oh, Chris, this is the first guy that put my picture in a paper." And even now, she still remembers it. So does Chris Stein, it's kind of nice, is that when they do remember you.
Yeah, that's nice to hear. And I guess for her, from her perspective at that time, it was probably just another run-of-the-mill gig with the Stilettos at this club, not expecting someone from a paper such as Melody Maker to actually be there. And
no, well, none of these acts, the Ramones, Talking Heads, the Television, none of these acts expected coverage from a paper like Melody Maker. And Melody Maker in London, they didn't expect it either because they hadn't a clue who all these acts were. But I remember that same summer, and I mentioned this in the book, that in June of that year, the Who played four straight gigs at Madison Square Garden, or 4 in 1 week anyway, which at the time was the biggest run of shows any act had played at the Garden. And on one of the nights, Pete had asked me if there were any New York bands he should see, and I said, well, maybe I should take you down to see these little. They didn't call them punk rock, and that expression hadn't been invented, I just call them spiky little groups. And I took him to see television actually, and he really liked television, um, which was interesting. And John Entwistle came, and John hated him, but John was always a traditionalist, you know. So Pete was into seeking out new acts as well. I think he wanted to see what the competition was that was coming up behind him, you know. But he was interested in that kind of thing. Far more apart. No, the only other act that was interested in that kind of thing was David Bowie, of course. He was always interested in young bands and seeking them out too. Most acts, though, were content to stay where they were. You know what I mean? I mean, I wouldn't have dreamt of taking anybody from, say, Yes down there. They wouldn't have known where they were.
Yeah, we're talking poles apart there, I think.
I think we are, yeah.
One thing I was curious about, so you said just then, and you mentioned in the book, you were going to sort of roughly 3 to 4 gigs a week. Did it badly affect your hearing at all?
It didn't at the time. My wife tells me I'm going deaf now, but I don't think I am. I have to put the TV a bit when I'm watching TV at home here. The hearing thing is quite interesting because often, if I'd been watching a gig from the side of the stage, which I tended to do more so than in the first 2 or 3 rows, then certainly my ears were ringing after the gig and the next day. But if I didn't do it too many shows in a row, then it was okay. But I can understand it. But what's happened to Townsend, to Pete's ears, because if you do that every night for 3 or 4 nights on the trot, then your ears never stop ringing. I remember it happened with. I think I mentioned this in the book. It happened with Grand Funk Railroad. My ears were ringing after them. And it often happened with Slade as well. Slade were distressingly loud, they could be. And it happened once or twice with Deep Purple and with The Who. It never actually happened with Led Zeppelin, funnily enough. But I don't think I ever got ringing ears after them. I think that's possibly because I don't think I ever watched Led Zeppelin from the side of the stage, like I did with The Who and the others I just mentioned. They were a bit more choosy about who was allowed on stage.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of The Who, could you tell us a little bit about when you first discovered them and how you first discovered them?
Well, The Who, as anybody who reads this book will discover, were the act I liked the most. Like most people, I was brought up in the north of England, and The Who were a band from London, so I didn't actually get to see them live until 1969. However, I had seen them on TV. I had seen them on Ready, Steady, Go, and I thought they looked fantastic because there was something about them. They looked a bit odder. They looked a bit different from other groups because they dressed differently. The guitarist spun his arm round. The drummer looked like a madman. You know what I mean? And I thought this is a really interesting group. Is this? I also like the records. I bought a lot of their singles during the 60s. Though the first album I bought, I didn't buy an album there till Sellout. I think I got one called Direct Hits, which was the best of. But I really liked them. But I never had a chance to go and see them because they were never playing anywhere near where I lived. But in 1969, I'd moved down south, and I went to see them at the Plumpton Festival. It was the National Jazz and Rock Festival, it was called, and it was at Plumpton Racecourse, which is not far from Brighton. And they put out Tommy that summer, of course, and I bought Tommy, and I loved Tommy. I was listening to that at home on my crappy little record player, and so when I went to see them for the first time, I pushed my way to the front, and it was fantastic. I'd never seen anything like it. I'd never seen a group that was so energetic on stage, and the athleticism, if you like, of Townsend was outrageous. I'd never ever seen. Most guitar players just stood there and played. Well, he was running around everywhere, jumping up and down, spinning his arm. And Moon was going potty on drums. Roger was, swinging the microphone around like this and everything. And they did the whole of Tommy. Well, I'll say the whole of Tommy. They did most of the songs from Tommy, almost all of them, as in one, it's like 40-minute selection, without stopping virtually. Well, I've never seen anything like that. Nor had I heard a group as loud as them either. And I thought, this is it. This is what I want to be. I want to be something to do. I want to be part of this. This was a year before I joined Melody Maker, and once I joined then I made a point of going to see the Who as often as I could, and I made a point of befriending them, which was very easy to do because they were very friendly. And it was Moon who introduced me to the other three. Keith seemed to take on the role almost as the group's spokesman and publicist, right? I know Townsend was a great interview and very intellectual and all that, but Mooney was the one who was almost like the PR agent, press agent, Mr. Nice Guy, Mr. Fun Guy with journalists. And he, like I say in the book, he actually rang me up at the paper. He'd never met me in his life, rang me up to thank me for a nice review I gave. And he said he wanted to meet me. So I met him, and that started the whole thing off, really. I went to a show with him in his Rolls Royce car, met the others, and from then on, I just hung on there for the ride, and so I became the nearest thing that Melody Maker had to a Who correspondent. And I counted up, I saw them 27 times during the course of my career, so 27 times with Mooney on drums, in
Wow.
America and in the UK. Lots of times in America. I would imagine in America about 10 times I saw them. And I would hang out backstage with them and everything. I went to all of their homes in the UK and wrote about them extensively. And I got to know them as people as well as rock stars, if you know what I mean. I kind of, and this never happened with any other groups. I met their wives, and during the early part of my career on Pete was writing a monthly column for Melody Maker, and this was the days before faxes and let alone emails that we have now. So he typed that out, and someone had to go to his house in Twickenham and pick it up. And so I volunteered. Yes, mister, I'll go. And so I volunteered. So I met Karen, his wife, and his two little girls who were about 3 or 4 years age, and I'd be there, and they'd all be sat around the dining room table, and Pete would say, "Oh, come in, do you want a cup of tea?" And so I'd chat with the family. But this didn't happen with any other act, right? And then I went to see John in his house in Ealing, where he had his wife. Lord, I forgot her name now. Alison, that's right, and his son Christopher. So I met them all, and Mooney lived in Chertsey at the time in this crazy house that he bought, which is not far away from where I live now. And I went to see Roger at his castle. Well, he had a manor house on the Kent-Sussex border in a place called Burwash. So I went to all of their homes and got to know them really well. And because I got to know them well, I could see the issues that they had, if you like. Whereas I didn't get to know any other group as well as that. I mean, Led Zeppelin obviously had issues, one way or another, but I never got to know them and see them from the inside, from their point of view. The thing about the Who is that Pete was always wanting to push forward. He was a sort of visionary kind of guy who was never content to sit on his arse and sit, on the laurels, as you were, right? Whereas the other three more or less were. They say, "Don't rock the boat, Pete. We're doing all right. Don't rock the boat. Don't change." But Pete wouldn't. Pete was frustrated. He always wanted to change things. And if it was thanks to him, of course, that they became as good as they did. It was thanks to him they got Tommy and then Quadrophenia, and they introduced the synthesizers to say. So it's Pete's changes actually pushed things forward and kept them at the forefront, even though the other three were less inclined to change things. But I saw all this from the inside, um, and I think Pete wanted changes somehow. Pete, I think, would have introduced a keyboard player on stage, let's say, um, before Keith died. He would have changed he'd put a synthesizer on. He would have changed things, but the Who had a kind of a gang mentality, and this gang mentality was very important to their image, especially in America. Um, but there you go. Because I got to know them so well. When Keith died, I thought it was all over for a while. I thought, oh, it won't be the same. And it took me quite a long time to go and see them with Kenny Jones. I waited until 1980, actually. And then only because my then girlfriend at the time wanted to go and see him. And I kept saying, no, I don't want to bother. It won't be the same. And eventually I did. And then much later on, of course, I went to see them again and again. And I renewed my friendship with them, and they asked me to produce the box set and their work on the the reissues of the CDs, which first time around were dreadful, but we put them together, we remastered them, and I commissioned the booklets and helped John Astley sequence the new material and the unreleased material that appeared in the first wave of reissues around the end of the 90s.
What are your feelings on what they're doing nowadays with the orchestra?
I'm not really into that. I'm gonna be a confession now. I didn't go and see them with the orchestra. The last time I actually saw them live was in Hyde Park, which was about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, I suppose. I quite like that show. I like the one in Birmingham that I went to see on that tour quite a bit more. Um, I think Keith would turn over in his grave if he thought the Who were playing with an orchestra. I just wasn't really interested. I'll look at it on YouTube, a bit, but it's not really for me, isn't that? I mean, when you were as lucky as I was to see the four of them at the peak of their powers during the 1970s, um, then anything's going to be a bit of a come down, I think. I don't know. It seems to me that one of the great things about the Who is that they were unpredictable. The Who that I liked the best was unpredictable. And a number could last 2 minutes or it could last 5 minutes. It just depended whether Pete wanted to extend the solos or not, or whatever. And sometimes when they were on a roll, and Roger's just banging a tambourine, then the other three were just zooming away, all right? And you could tell that John and Keith were looking at Pete as if to say, where are we going next, Pete? And he'd go, and he'd go there, right? And he'd spin and go there, and he'd go, and some of the solos then were just spontaneous, That's what I really loved about them. Well, you don't get much spontaneity with an orchestra, do you? You know what I mean? You got 20 people behind you there playing violins. They're not going to go off on a tangent, are they? So that's one of the reasons, I guess, why a really well rehearsed Who, if you like, was not Optimum Who in my book. Optimum Who was when the four of them just went off at tangents. And sometimes I found that if I went to see them at an out of the way place, and by that I don't mean Los Angeles or New York, I mean somewhere like Philadelphia, where I saw a show where they were absolutely magnificent. At a show where there's probably no press, where they think they can just experiment and fool around a bit, then they were at their best. I have a bootleg of a show in Ottawa, which I think quite a lot of Who fans have got. And some of this show was on a live Tommy that they put out along with a remixed Tommy later, right? And that is one of my favorite Who shows. Now, they were playing in Ottawa, right, of all places. And there's a young man blues there that goes on for about 15, 20 minutes. And it's absolutely brilliant. Pete's playing on that is just outstanding. It is. He plays like jazzy solo and what have you. And another thing I love is that live at the Fillmore 1968, which you've probably got. That CD that came out, I don't know, 3, 4 years ago. Then they finally released it officially. And the My Generation on that, I think this is My Generation. It lasts for 20 minutes, and it's before they did Snatches of Tommy in it. Now you can see Pete's working out ideas. It's such a long solo, right? Um, and that kind of thing doesn't happen now with rock bands. They don't play the same thing. I mean, you might accuse of Pink Floyd of doing it, but it's all worked out. But with the Who, they were just going into uncharted waters, and that's what I loved about the Who. And they were really exciting to watch, of course. There were no group who was ever as visual as they were, for my money, on stage. And they were so fluent. They were just so fluent, they were. And that comes, again, this is a point I think I make in my book. It comes from having played together for so long. The three of them before Mooney joined. There's the Detours, right? Roger, John, and Pete as the Detours in 1962 or whatever, right? So the Who played more shows before they had a hit single than Led Zeppelin played in their entire career. So that kind of thing. It's like the Beatles in Hamburg, and in the Cavern and in Liverpool for 2 or 3 years before they were famous, right? They played together so often, and they knew one another's strengths and weaknesses, maybe, that they could knit together so well. It's the same to a certain extent with Slade as well. There was the In-Betweens, played for 3 years around the Midlands before they got a sniff of a hit record. And I know Jim Lee, Jim Lee told me that when they had their first hit with that Get Down and Get With It in 1971, they went on Top of the Pops, and they looked around at some of these groups on Top of the Pops, like in the middle of the road, and they looked around at these groups and they thought, we're made here, because none of these groups have played together very much, right? They've all been put together for a studio single, you know what I mean, in the studio. So Jim said, we're going to crack this. We better know these lot put together, he said. Jim knows, was pretty, talked it like he meant it, and he was right, because they were so good live. They, a group that plays together for 2 or 3 years before they see the inside of a recording studio and play regularly, 2 or 3 times a week for that time, are going to get good, even if they don't start out very good, they will become good. And that's what happened with the Who, it's what happened with the Beatles, but most assuredly it turned the Who into the live act they were.
Yeah, for me personally, it's almost impossible to comprehend how good the Who must have been in their prime, because I saw them, the second time I saw them was in 1999 at the Shepherd's Bush Empire with as a 5-piece, and for me that was one of the most exciting things in my life, especially watching Pete Townsend on stage. So so it's almost difficult to comprehend just how exciting they were when it was the original
with Keith
lineup
on the drums. Yeah, I was at one of the. They did 2 shows. They were Christmas shows, weren't they? Around about Christmas time.
Yeah, I was at the Thursday night one, the second one.
Some charity. I went to the second one, I think. My friend Ed Hannell went to the first one. I wrote about them in Record Collector magazine. They were pretty good. In fact, that stripped down Who, for my money, was better than the Who with lots of people on stage. But what I find interesting with that, when I saw them, I think, at Wembley Arena on that tour in, was it 1989, 1990s, when they did this Tommy, and they had like 4 backup singers and brass instruments and 2 drummers and 2 guitarists and all this kind of thing. And John had been told that he had to turn down by Pete, because it was, wrecking his hearing, his ears, And in order for John to turn down, they needed something like 9 other people on stage. I think a lot of people underestimated John Entwistle's contribution to the Who when it was just the 4 of them. Because he didn't play the bass guitar like anyone else. He didn't just have a dum kind of bass lines. He had his bass sort of almost treble, twangy sound. He did, right, and he was hitting a sort of a mid-range harmonic that in other bands a rhythm guitarist might hit. So as well as playing bass, he was playing a sort of rhythm guitar. And I think also, oddly enough, quite a lot of people might have thought that what he was doing was being played by Pete some of the time. And uh, I don't know whether you probably wouldn't, because of your age, ever saw any of John's bands on his own. But
No, I
when
didn't.
you went
No.
to see the Ox, as he called his band, on his own, right? You heard that bass sound, and they sounded a little bit like the Who, and you thought, the reason they sound like the Who is because of that unique bass harmonic that he managed to get from his equipment, from his guitars. He had them specially made for him. I mean, he was one of the world's greatest bass guitarists, I think. And anybody who played bass guitar will tell you that. He was so dexterous, he was, with his playing. But all three of them were. Moon as a drummer as well. I mean, forgetting the lunatic, he was a stupendous drummer because he followed the vocal lines as well as trying to keep the pace. But John, to a certain extent, was the rhythmic foundation. And Pete said he never played a drum solo, but people will tell you that every song was a drum solo.
Yeah, played nothing but drum solos.
Yes, exactly. He played a drum solo in every song.
And there we have it, my conversation with Chris Charlesworth from October this year. As I said earlier, I was lucky enough to receive an advance copy of the new memoir, Just Backdated, and I'd like to personally thank Chris, as well as Richard Houghton at Spenwood Books, for arranging for that to be sent to me. I also got a chance to show Chris my copy of his book, the illustrated biography, that I've had since I was a small child, which was a bit of a thrill for me. I had a great time chatting with Chris and was just transfixed by his stories and memories. If you'd like to hear more of my conversation with Chris, then please consider becoming a supporter of this podcast at patreon.com/talkingaboutthewho. As well as helping us to make more episodes, you could also have access to semi-regular bits of bonus content throughout Season 1 and beyond. Patreon.com/talkingaboutthewho. You can also support us with a one-off donation at buymeacoffee.com/talkingaboutthewho. And that's it for this episode. I'll see you again in 2 weeks' time. Until then, thanks for listening, look after yourselves, and as Roger Daltrey always says, be lucky. Goodbye.